Hi, welcome to Unit 5, Lesson 3. So we're still looking at problems where we are calculating with percents. And if you think back to Unit 5, Lesson 2, we looked at the percent proportion. So we solved percent problems by setting up a proportion. And in this lesson, we'll be looking at lots of the same types of problems, but instead of setting up a proportion, we will solve these questions by setting up an equation. And the equation really is the result of the proportion that you learned in the last lesson. So this is not a situation where you use the equation sometimes and the proportion other times. You can kind of play around with both and decide which one you're more comfortable with, and then just go with that one. So really just showing you another strategy that you can use for solving percent problems. This is the percent equation. So over in the top left of your notes, you'll see sort of some clues about how to set your equation up. So when you see the what, so like what percent or what is the total, that's the thing that you're looking for. So in the last lesson, we had the guy with a little detective spyglass where you were trying to figure out what is it that I'm being asked to find. So your clue is the question word what. So if it says what is the percent, then you know that your variable goes for your percent. If it says what is the total, then you know your variable goes with whatever the whole is. So when you see what, that's the number that you are looking for, and that's where you'll use your variable. And then when you see is, that'll be your equal sign, because when I say in math that one thing is another, then I'm saying that those things are equal. So that's where I'll use my equal sign. And then the word of, think back to the first lesson, we found percent of a number, we multiplied. So where you see of, that would be multiplication. And then of course, your percent is easy to recognize. The key here is when you're dealing with percents, you want to make sure that you write all of your percent values in their decimal form. When we calculate with percent values, they have to be written in their decimal form. So we're going to start out over here on the far right and solve just some basic calculation problems by using these keywords and setting up an equation. So the first one says, what is 54% of 620? So there's our what. So that's our variable. What is, so that's equals 54%. So we'll write that as 54 hundredths of multiply 620. So we end up with x equals 54 hundredths times 620. So we'll just multiply 620 times 0.54. So 4 times 0 is 0, 4 times 2 is 8, 4 times 6 is 24, and then 0 over. Then we have 5 times 0 is 0, 5 times 2 is 10, 5 times 6 is 30, plus 1 is 31, and then we'll just add. And then in the question, we have 2 digits after a decimal. So in the problem, we'll have 2 digits after the decimal. So our answer is 334 and 8/10. So 54% of 620 is 334 and 8/10. Look at the next one. 78 is 20% of what number? So we'll use our keywords and then set up the equation. So 78, so just write that, is equals 20%. Move that decimal 2 to the left, so we get 0.2 or 2/10. You could also write 20 hundredths. That's the same thing. Of, so multiply what number? So 78 equals 2/10 times x. Well, to undo multiplying, we divide. And that gets rid of it over here. So x equals 78 divided by 2/10. 78 divided by 2/10. Can't have a decimal outside the house, so move it over 1, which means we have to move the decimal over 1 inside the house, and we'll fill that hole with a 0. And then 2 will go into 7 3 times. 3 times 2 is 6. Subtract and drop the 8, and 2 goes into 18 9 times. 9 times 2 is 18. So subtract, we get 0, and then drop that other 0, and 2 goes into 0 0 times. So we get 390 equals x. So it said 78 is 20% of what number? Well, 78 is 20% of 390. So 390 there is my whole, 78 is my part, and then 20 would be my percent. Okay, next one. 35 is what percent of 420? Again, we'll use those keywords instead of our equation. 35 is what percent of 420? Okay, now I have to be careful here because this says what percent. So we'll have to write our answer in terms of a percent. So we undo multiplying by dividing. So we'll divide both sides by 420. It's right over here. And so we have 35 divided by 420. And 420 won't go into 35, so I'll erase a decimal and drop a 0. And 420 won't go into 350, so I'll drop another 0. So now I need to kind of play with 420. Let's try times 8. 8 times 0 is 0. 8 times 2 is 16. 8 times 4 is 32. Plus 1 is 33. And that looks like that's as far as it will go. And that's 3,360. And then we'll subtract. And then we can drop another 0. And now we have 420 into 1,400. So let's look at maybe 3. 3 times 0 is 0. 3 times 2 is 6. 3 times 4 is 12. Okay, and it hasn't come out evenly yet, but we can go ahead and stop there and just round. So there's our decimal. So here's what we have. We have 83 thousandths equals X, but we want that as a percent. So we're going to take that decimal, move it 2 to the right. So about 8.3%. So not quite 10%, which makes sense because 10% of 420 would be 42. So it makes sense that 35 is a little less than 10% of 420. Okay, now let's apply this to a real world situation. So the first one says, Easton, an electrician, worked on a project for 7 months out of the year. For what percent of the year did he work on the project? And it says we can round to the nearest hundred. So for what percent of the year? Well, he worked for 7 months out of the year. So we want to know 7 is what percent of a year? And since 7 is months, I didn't think of a year as months. 7 is what percent of 12? And now we'll set that up as an equation. 7 is what percent of 12? And then just divide both sides by 12. And that gets rid of itself. So we have 7 divided by 12. And 12 won't go into 7, so I'll raise a decimal, drop a 0. 12 will go into 75 times. That's 60. Drop a 0. Oop, run out of room, so I'm going to put my 100 up here. So 12 will go into 100 8 times. 8 times 12 is 96. Subtract, I can drop another 0. 12 will go into 43 times, and we can stop there. So we have 0.583 or 583 thousandths, but our question again was what percent? So to write that decimal as a percent, I need to move that decimal 2 to the right. So about, about 58 3/10%. We actually rounded that to the nearest tenths place, but that's fine. That's close enough. So we're at about that he worked for about 58% of the year. Okay, which makes sense. 6 months would be half of a year, 50%. So it makes sense that 7 months would be a little bit more than half, which 58.3% makes sense. Okay, next one. A student correctly answered 86 questions on a test and earned a grade of 98%. How many questions were on the test? Assume each question had the same point value. Okay, so they correctly answered 86 questions on the test. So that was the part they answered correctly, and they earned a grade of 98%. So 86 is 98% of what? And that will get us our total. So now we'll put that up as an equation. 86 is 98% of what? Again, remember, we wrote that percent as a decimal by just moving that decimal 2 to the left. And now we can divide both sides by 0.98 or 98 hundredths. So to get our answer, we'll have 86 divided by 98 hundredths. And we can't have a decimal outside the house, move it 2 to the right, which means we come inside the house and move that 2 to the right, and then decimal on the roof. Okay, fill those holes with a 0. So 98 won't go into 8. It also won't go into 86. So we're looking at how many times will 98 go into 860? Let's try 9. 1 times 8 is 72. 9 times 9 is 81. Plus 7 is 88. So not quite. So let's try 98 times 8. 8 times 8 is 64. 8 times 9 is 72. Plus 6 is 78. So it will go in 8 times. And that got us 784. And now we'll subtract. And drop the 0. So now we have 98 into 760. Well, 98 times 8 was 784, so it's a little too big. So we'll do 98 times 7. 7 times 8 is 56. 7 times 9 is 63, plus 5 is 68. So it'll go into 767 times, and that is 686. And then we'll subtract. And we can drop another 0. And that would go in 7 times as well. And so we can round now. So there were about, of course, you can't have 7/10 of a question. You can't have part of a question. So we would say that this test had about 88 questions. So if you answer 86 questions correctly on an 88 question test, you would score a 98%. So that is it for solving percent questions by setting up the equation. Again, it's all about setting up keywords. So when you see the is, that's your equal sign. When you see the what, that's your variable. When you see of, that's multiply. And then, of course, your percent values, you'll have to write those as decimals in order to calculate. If you have any questions, please let us know. If you're ready to have the skill check open, we'll do that for you. Or we're happy to show you some more examples if you're not feeling quite ready to try this skill on your own. Thanks and have a great day.